Time for Focus. And 2 years after 130 people were killed in terror attacks in Paris, we have a report on some of the people deeply affected by the violence. A witness who helped victims, a survivor who's written a book about her experience, and 2 people who were inspired to take their lives in a different direction because of the attacks that led to a state of emergency being imposed. Pierrick Leurent and Aurore Dupuis report.
That night, their lives were at a crossroads. On the 13th of November 2015, they were out dancing, dining or working when gunmen and suicide bombers attacked Paris. How are the French coping 2 years after Europe's deadliest attacks in a decade?
It's hard to imagine that this terrace was filled with bodies on the floor.
Jean-Luc Vertenschlag witnessed the shooting from his window, just above La Belle Équipe. He ran to the restaurant to help the wounded.
I see this empty space every day when I leave my flat. I feel proud because thanks to ordinary people, that night no more names were added to the plaque.
Jean-Luc saved a woman's life using his belt as a tourniquet to stop the bleeding. He now carries a first aid kit at all times.
This bag contains all the equipment we lacked that night to help the victims, people who had bullet wounds and other serious injuries. There's a tourniquet, bandages, emergency blankets. It's not paranoia, it's called being ready. And when you're ready, you're more calm.
Jean-Luc says he could have saved more lives if he had the right medical equipment. Lassen Bourga went even further. The railway security agent recently enrolled in the police force as a reservist. Physical training, law enforcement, use of weapons. Lassen says that's the only way for him to protect the population.
I asked myself, what can I do to fight against what happened? It was so unfair. I felt a lot of empathy because I'm a father. It could have happened to my wife, my children, myself, my family.
Lassen was working at the Gare du Nord train station when the terrorists hit. Since then, he's decided to patrol the streets, keeping a close eye on schools and public spaces.
I feel safe now, my team supports me, and with that trust I go on the field every day to reassure people. I thought to myself, I have to act, to protect and to serve my country.
Caroline Langlade wants to, quote, repair survivors. She set up a victims association while trying to heal herself. She was held hostage at the Bataclan for more than 3 hours, and with the help of aid workers, she's trying to overcome her fears.
On the 13th of November, I felt like I was cut in half, and that I lost one half of myself, meaning I've lost my innocence, my belief in the future, and in the beauty of this world. Over the past 2 years, I've learnt to fill this empty half with the love that others have given me.
Healing with love, but also with words. Caroline has written her story in a book. Emergency Exits raises awareness and sends a message to readers.
I'd like to give hope to anyone who could potentially go through what we've been through, and tell them that despite being the victim of a terrorist attack, life does go on and there is a future.
Thomas Zaruba has taken the future into his own hands. He was supposed to meet a friend at one of the bars targeted by terrorists, but he cancelled at the last minute. After the attacks, he decided to change jobs. From publicist for major companies, he turned to music, his passion.
I thought to myself, death is just around the corner. All the projects that I put aside, I've got to do them now, so go for it.
A few days later, Thomas produced an album in honor of the victims.
When I received letters from people who had listened to my music and said it helped me move on, I thought I did the right thing. In my previous life, when I signed a deal with a company, I didn't get that kind of messages.
Thomas is performing at the commemorations in Paris, music therapy for those scarred by the 13th of November attacks.
Joining me now is Joseph Downing, an expert in French politics, security and Muslims in France, who teaches at LSE's European Institute. Hello, thank you very much indeed for joining us for today's focus. Now, the report we just broadcast was on some of the people who were particularly affected by the attacks here in Paris 2 years ago. How would you say French society as a whole was affected?
I think this, basically it sent just huge shockwaves through the whole of French society. This was, and not just French society, to be honest with you. European society and societies all over the world, just by the nature of this being the first in what has become a pattern of attacks on completely innocent individuals, basically in their leisure time. And this is a massive, this is a huge blow, really, to all societies across the world where people go out and enjoy their leisure time. I think in France in particular, because it struck at these highly symbolic venues of, the freedom of expression through music, people enjoying their leisure time in cafes, it was just it's an absolute disaster.
Now, obviously, people are still afraid, and the French authorities have been talking about how many attacks they've foiled. Do you think, on the whole, the French authorities have done a good job in terms of managing fears? Of course, we have military patrols now, where people in uniform out in the streets.
I think we have to be a little bit cautious when we quote statistics that governments or security forces give us about possible foiled attacks, because we automatically think that the attacks that are foiled are similar to those horrific events that we saw in Paris those years ago. It's not the case. If you look at the empirical evidence on the ground, sometimes what authorities claim as foiled attacks are actually based on very flimsy evidence and are quite questionable. In terms of putting military patrols on the streets, this is something that has had an effect in terms of possibly reassuring the public. But whether or not it's actually been a successful policy from a security perspective is quite questionable. It hasn't stopped actually future attacks taking place on French soil. And paradoxically, it's also given possible attackers new targets to target on the streets of French cities. It's a bit of a strange situation, but the fact that you have armed patrols of maybe 3 or 4 young conscripts, roaming around French cities has created those basically moving targets for people to use to carry out attacks. This has happened numerous times where these security personnel have been repeatedly targeted. So in a sense, while it politically maybe has reassured people, its effectiveness from a security perspective is quite questionable. And also, it's also, had this unimagined outcome of actually creating more targets for further attacks.
And also, like you said, the scale of the attack here in Paris 2 years ago was one thing, an organised network, and perhaps the intelligence services have improved in terms of cracking down on that sort of thing. But not much can be done, I understand, really, when it comes to so-called lone wolf attacks, people just grabbing a van and ramming into people.
Yeah, and the emergence of these low-tech operations, both in France and also here in the UK. We had this in London Bridge. We've had this a few times across, different parts of the UK. Is really frightening, because you literally cannot realistically, feasibly do security checks on everybody that rents a car, for example, or owns a vehicle. And this represents quite a dangerous departure, really, in terms of new forms of tactics. But, if we think about the intelligence picture, for me, agile, reliable, embedded kind of intelligence gathering really has to be at the heart of tackling this wave of attacks across Europe. I'm not sure. There is some work that's been done. Macron has brought out new reforms to bring in essential sort of anti-terror commands within France. But the picture still remains very much one of scattered agencies, both within France and across Europe, who are painting their own pictures and maybe not speaking to each other as much as we'd like them to. And also, there is also still quite a deficit of trust between European security services. I mean, people are very reluctant to share information with security services, say in Belgium, for example, which, as we know, has produced a number of attackers in recent years, because they really don't trust the competency of the Belgian security services to not compromise intelligence, to not leak information, to actually act responsibly in the light of a possible threat. Obviously, this is quite an extreme case, but it highlights a bigger picture where established security services are still maybe not as trusting of each other and as open with sharing of information and tracking of suspects as we'd perhaps like them to be.
And briefly, if you could, what does the fact that the Islamic State group has lost so much territory mean in terms of jihadists coming back to Europe?
This is a really, really interesting question, because if you were to ask me this even maybe 2 years ago, we had a lot of worries in Europe about the possibility of numbers of returning fighters. Now, we have to be careful here, because the numbers of people that have actually gone to fight with the Islamic State from France and even from the UK is actually really quite small. Estimates from maybe around 6 to 7 million Muslims in France, only around 1,500 to 2,000 have actually gone to fight with the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Now, this is obviously not a negligible number when you think about maybe tracking them if they return to France, but the reality of the situation is, because the military campaigns orchestrated both by the Syrian army, its proxies in Hezbollah and the Iranian military forces, Russia, US, and coalition bombing, very few of them are still left alive to come back. Those that are alive that have managed to get out of Syria are actually now stuck mainly in Turkey.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and your analysis. And thank you for watching. Stay tuned.